Deja Johnson woke up early on a Saturday morning, feeling the warmth of the sun streaming through the curtains. As she stretched and got out of bed, Marcus was already up and getting ready for his day. He was a police officer who worked hard, but always found time to support his family and stand by Deja, no matter what. They had moved to a new neighborhood, recently hoping for a fresh start after years of hard work. Deja had finally started to see the fruits of her labor. She was proud of her accomplishments and her ability to navigate a world where the odds were sometimes stacked against her, but she wasn't one to let life's challenges stop her from living her best life. After a quick breakfast together, Deja decided to spend the day running errands in the city she loved, having a few hours to herself, without any interruptions, and today was perfect for a little shopping. She put on a light summer dress and a pair of comfortable sandals before grabbing her keys and heading out the door. As she drove through the streets of the upscale neighborhood, she couldn't help but admire the tree-lined roads and beautiful homes. She had always dreamed of living in a place like this, and now it was a reality. Her first stop was a boutique she had been meaning to check out. The moment she parked her car and stepped out, Deja felt the crisp air of the morning wrap around her. It was a peaceful moment, and as she walked into the store, she felt the familiar sense of calm that came with being surrounded by luxury items. The store was beautifully designed, and the shelves were lined with elegant clothes and accessories. She walked through the aisles, running her fingers over the fabric of different dresses, admiring the craftsmanship of each piece. It was a place she felt comfortable in, and it was a nice change of pace from the usual bustle of the city. As she made her way to the jewelry section, Deja spotted a delicate gold necklace on display. It caught her eye instantly, and she found herself studying it for a moment, wondering if it would be the perfect gift for her mother's upcoming birthday. The sales associate approached her with a smile, asking if she needed help, and Deja politely declined. She was simply browsing. But as she stood there admiring the necklace, she noticed a pair of eyes watching her from the other side of the store. The young clerk who had been tidying the racks of clothing had a suspicious look on her face. She seemed to be glancing in Deja's direction every few seconds, as if she was waiting for something to happen. Deja could feel the weight of her gaze, but she tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing, she thought. But as she moved closer to the necklace, the clerk walked up to her. With a hurried pace, her tone was direct and sharp. "Excuse me, miss, can I help you with that?" she asked. As Deja turned to face her, a sense of unease crept over her. The clerk's eyes were locked on her with an intensity that felt like accusation. Deja smiled politely and said, "No, thank you, just looking." But the clerk didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in closer. "I saw you slip that necklace into your bag," she said, her voice now colder than before. Deja froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on her chest. She quickly glanced down at her bag, half expecting to see the necklace there, but it wasn't. She hadn't touched it. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "I didn't steal anything," Deja said, her voice calm but firm. She tried to keep her tone neutral, but there was a hint of disbelief creeping in. The clerk's expression hardened, and without saying another word, she signaled to a nearby security guard. Deja felt a sudden rush of panic surge through her, her heart pounding as the security guard approached. He was a large man with a no-nonsense look on his face, his hands crossed over his chest. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Deja and the clerk. The clerk, not missing a beat, pointed at Deja and said, "She just tried to steal that necklace. I saw her do it." Deja shook her head quickly, her mind struggling to grasp the situation. "No, I didn't. I was just looking at it," she repeated. "I've been here for less than 5 minutes. I'm not stealing anything." But the security guard wasn't convinced. His eyes flicked to Deja's bag, as though expecting to find the stolen necklace there. "I'll have to check your bag," he said, his voice more forceful now. Deja's stomach dropped. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being accused in front of a growing crowd of shoppers who were starting to notice the commotion. She opened her bag and held it out to him, her hands trembling slightly. He rummaged through it quickly, his movements sharp and dismissive, not even bothering to look at her face as he searched. Nothing. The necklace wasn't there. He looked at her for a moment, his eyes narrowing, before turning to the clerk. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone now tinged with doubt. The clerk, undeterred, nodded. Yes, I saw her put it in her bag, she insisted. Deja felt her patience thin. She knew there was no point in arguing with the clerk any longer, but the way she was being treated left her seething inside. She was a paying customer, here to shop, not to be accused of theft. It didn't make sense. Her thoughts turned to her husband, Marcus, who was always the calm, collected one in stressful situations. He was a police officer, someone who knew how to navigate tough situations with dignity and respect. But more importantly, he knew how to make things right when they went wrong. "I'm calling my husband," Deja said, her voice now steady, though her heart was still racing. She wasn't going to let this go. She took out her phone and texted Marcus, briefly explaining the situation. As she pressed send, she noticed the eyes of the other customers in the store, many of whom were now watching her with growing interest. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but no one spoke up. The silence was suffocating. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Deja stood there, trying to remain composed, but the humiliation gnawed at her insides. She had never imagined a simple shopping trip would turn into something like this. The clerk's glare and the accusing stares from the security guard made her feel small, invisible, and utterly out of place in a space that should have been welcoming. She just wanted to leave, but she couldn't. Not without making sure her dignity wasn't stripped away. Not without someone standing up for her. Deja's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Marcus. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly pressed the green button to answer. "Deja, what's going on?" Marcus' calm, steady voice was a lifeline in the chaos unfolding around her. "I'm being accused of stealing." Deja's voice cracked slightly, despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I didn't do it, Marcus. They think I took a necklace, but I swear I didn't touch it." There was a pause on the other end, and Deja could hear Marcus taking a deep breath. She knew he was trying to stay calm, trying to gather his thoughts before speaking. "I'm on my way," he said simply. "Stay there, don't leave, and don't sign anything or agree to anything until I get there." "Okay," Deja whispered, relief washing over her just at the sound of his voice. She could almost picture him getting dressed quickly, grabbing his keys and hurrying out the door. Deja took a steadying breath, trying to calm her nerves. The store manager had arrived now, and she stood nearby, looking more than a little uncomfortable as she overheard Deja's conversation. She had been one of the silent bystanders to the growing tension in the store, and now that it was clear Deja wasn't backing down, her discomfort was apparent. "Ma'am," the manager said hesitantly, her eyes flicking from Deja to the security guard, "I think we should resolve this calmly. Let's just see if we can straighten this out before your husband arrives." Deja looked at the woman, her lips pressed tightly together. "I don't need you to straighten it out," Deja replied sharply. "I need an apology for you and your staff accusing me in front of everyone without cause, for treating me like a criminal when I've done nothing wrong." The manager's face flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment, the door to the boutique swung open with a sharp clang, and Marcus stepped inside. Deja felt a wave of relief and gratitude as soon as she saw him. Tall, confident, and immediately commanding attention. His presence was a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in the store. The room seemed to shift as though the very air became clearer when Marcus entered. "Where's my wife?" Marcus's voice rang out, authoritative yet calm, cutting through the murmurs from the small crowd of shoppers. Deja smiled faintly as she saw him approach, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. She hadn't realized how much the experience had shaken her until Marcus was there, ready to fight for her. "I'm here, Marcus," she said softly, stepping toward him. "I haven't done anything wrong. I just wanted to shop, and now they're accusing me of stealing." Marcus's expression shifted to one of frustration, but he kept his voice level. "What happened?" he asked, turning toward the security guard and the manager. The manager tried to speak, but Marcus raised his hand to silence her. He wasn't interested in excuses or apologies. He wanted to understand the facts. The security guard quickly gave a brief account, recounting the accusation made by the clerk. She was seen putting the necklace into her bag, the guard said, his voice defensive. Marcus turned to the clerk, who had been standing in the back, and gave her a long, assessing look. "You saw her do that?" he asked, his tone clipped but measured. "Yes," the clerk answered, though her voice wavered slightly under Marcus's scrutiny. Marcus let out a small sigh, running his fingers through his hair. He knew this wasn't just about the necklace, it was about the way Dija had been treated. "So, you're telling me that without verifying anything, you assumed my wife was a thief?" he asked, his voice cold now. The clerk, suddenly aware of who Marcus was, hesitated. The room fell silent, the tension thick as everyone realized who he was. The manager's eyes widened. "I, didn't realize she was your wife, sir," she stammered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Dija watched as Marcus stood tall, his presence now commanding every corner of the store. He had a quiet strength about him, and as the situation started to unfold, the balance of power shifted. What had started as an accusation against her was now turning into a battle for her dignity. She stood beside him, feeling a growing sense of justice rise in her chest. "I want an apology," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "for my wife and for every person who's ever been wronged in a store like this. And I want to make sure this never happens again." The manager nodded quickly, looking thoroughly chastened. "Of course, Officer Johnson. We're terribly sorry for the misunderstanding," she said, her voice quieter now. Dija stayed silent, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. This moment wasn't just about a necklace or an accusation. It was about something bigger, something that affected far more than just her. This wasn't the first time she felt out of place or judged based on how she looked, but now she had someone who would stand beside her, someone who knew what needed to be done. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him as he stood there, eyeing the store manager, who now seemed completely flustered. His mind was already running through the steps they needed to take to resolve the situation, but part of him was seething with anger. He couldn't shake the image of Dija being falsely accused in front of a crowd, humiliated for something she hadn't done. It wasn't just about the necklace, it was about how people were so quick to judge her based on the color of her skin. Dija stood beside him, calm but resolute, her expression unwavering. She wasn't about to let this go, and neither was he. His role as a police officer had often put him in situations where he needed to be measured, to keep the peace, but today, this was different. This wasn't just another day on the job. This was his wife, and there was no way he was going to let her walk away from this without ensuring that justice was done. The manager, now visibly uncomfortable, cleared her throat. "I truly apologize, Officer Johnson, for the misunderstanding," she said, her voice almost pleading. "We will make sure this never happens again. I can assure you we'll be more careful moving forward." Dija's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing together in a tight line. "It's not just about being more careful," she said, her voice cool and measured. "It's about accountability. I want to make sure your staff is properly trained, so no one else has to go through this." Marcus turned to look at her, admiring the strength in her voice. He knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted or wrongly accused. This moment, he'd realized, was bigger than just their experience at this boutique. It was a reminder of the systemic biases that existed in everyday life. He turned back to the manager. "You heard my wife," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I want you to make sure your staff understands the weight of these kinds of accusations. You can't just assume someone's guilty based on the way they look. We live in a time where people need to be treated with dignity and respect. I expect your store to take immediate steps to address this." The manager nodded quickly, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Absolutely, officer. We'll implement sensitivity training immediately. We can't afford to lose customers, and we certainly can't afford to have this kind of incident happen again." Marcus glanced at Dija, who was standing tall beside him. He could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had always driven her to fight for what was right. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent show of support. "I'm glad to hear that," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "But let's be clear, this isn't just about policy changes. This is about making sure people are treated fairly, no matter their race, no matter their background." I'm holding you accountable, and I expect action." Deja nodded in agreement. "We'll be watching," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't over. Not for us, not for anyone else who's been wronged." The manager, now visibly rattled, nodded again, her face pale. "Understood, Officer Johnson. We'll take immediate action. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." As Marcus turned to leave, Deja stayed close to his side, her mind already processing everything that had happened. The feeling of being falsely accused, of having her integrity questioned without cause. It wasn't something she would easily forget. But there was also a sense of empowerment in the way things had unfolded. With Marcus by her side, she felt stronger. Together, they had turned a painful experience into something constructive. As they stepped out of the store, Deja let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The tension in her body started to ease as they walked to the car, but the weight of the situation lingered in her mind. "Thank you for being there, Marcus," she said quietly, her voice soft. He glanced over at her, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You don't ever have to thank me for that. I'm always going to have your back. Always." They climbed into the car, the engine purring to life as they drove away. Deja couldn't shake the feeling that their fight wasn't just beginning. It was only the start of something bigger. The truth was, too many people had been silent for too long. She and Marcus weren't going to be among them. They were going to speak out, use their voices to make sure that incidents like this didn't go unnoticed, didn't fade into the background. And maybe, just maybe, they could spark a change. As they drove off into the afternoon, Deja felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one boutique. It was about making the world a better, fairer place for her, for Marcus, and for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. The days following the incident at the boutique were a whirlwind for Deja and Marcus. They had hoped that the situation would blow over, but it didn't. The events of that day lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the prejudice that still existed in the world. While the boutique had promised to take action, neither Deja nor Marcus was convinced that it would lead to any real change unless they pushed further. Deja couldn't shake the feeling that her experience wasn't an isolated one. She knew there were other women, especially women of color, who had been unfairly accused, looked down upon, or discriminated against. And it wasn't just about the boutique. It was about the small, everyday injustices that many people faced and accepted as normal. Deja wasn't going to let this go. She needed to do something more than just let the situation slide. She had to speak up to turn her pain into a force for change. Marcus, ever the calming influence, had supported her every step of the way. After they left the boutique, he encouraged her to write about the experience, to share it with others. He believed that their story could resonate with people, could spark a conversation about the importance of empathy, understanding, and fairness. One evening, as they sat on the couch in their cozy living room, Deja started drafting a post on social media. She wrote about the ordeal, about the shame and hurt of being accused of something she hadn't done, and about how being Black often meant being seen as a threat without reason. She poured her heart into the post, carefully crafting her words to highlight the way she had been treated, but also to remind people of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. When she hit post, she felt a rush of anxiety, but also a sense of liberation. It was scary to be so vulnerable, to put herself out there in such a public way. But she knew it was the right thing to do. Marcus sat beside her, holding her hand in silent support as the first notifications started coming in. At first, it was just a few likes and comments from friends, but then the responses started pouring in. People she didn't know began sharing their own stories, telling her about the times they had been judged unfairly, accused of things they hadn't done, or felt the sting of discrimination. Within hours, her post had gone viral. Her story was being shared across social media platforms, and soon, journalists were reaching out to her for interviews. Deja felt a mixture of disbelief and awe. She had never imagined her voice would have this much impact. But as she read through the comments, she realized just how much people were longing for change, for accountability, for a world where everyone could feel safe and valued. That night, Marcus watched her from across the room, his expression a mix of pride and admiration. "You're doing something incredible, Deja," he said quietly. "You've taken what happened and turned it into something powerful." She smiled at him, the exhaustion of the day starting to catch up with her, but her heart swelled with hope. "It's just the beginning," she replied. "If this makes even one person think differently, if it changes the way someone treats another person, then it's worth it." The next morning, Deja woke up to a flood of messages from people all over the world. Her story had sparked a movement, a wave of conversation about the subtle and not so subtle ways in which discrimination still permeated everyday life. She had never expected such a response, but she was determined to keep the momentum going. Marcus sat beside her at the breakfast table, his phone buzzing with notifications. "What's next for us?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. Deja looked at him, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We keep pushing. We keep sharing our truth, and we use our platform to make real change. This isn't over, not by a long shot." With that, Deja made the decision to take her fight even further. She began reaching out to local organizations, planning a community event to raise awareness about racial profiling and systemic discrimination. She wanted to create a space where people could speak openly about their experiences, a place where they could find solidarity and strength in one another. Marcus stood by her every step of the way, not just as her husband, but as her partner in this journey. He knew how important this was, and he was proud of the woman she had become. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Together, they would take this story to the world and stand firm, unwavering in their belief that change was not only possible, it was necessary. As the weeks passed, Deja's life took a turn she hadn't anticipated. What started as a social media post had evolved into something much larger, a movement in its own right. Deja found herself constantly in the spotlight, fielding interviews, meeting with community leaders, and speaking at events that brought together people from all walks of life. Her story had struck a nerve, resonating deeply with those who had felt the sting of unfair judgment, racial profiling, or discrimination. It was empowering but exhausting. The more Deja shared her experience, the more she realized how many people had suffered in silence, afraid to speak out or unsure how to navigate the systems that often made them feel invisible. But the flood of support also highlighted the stark reality of the world they lived in, a world where people of color were often treated with suspicion and mistrust simply because of the way they looked. Deja had become a voice for the voiceless, but she hadn't expected to be thrust into such a visible position. Sometimes she felt the weight of it all, her desire to keep fighting, to continue to raise awareness, while also managing the responsibilities of being a wife, a friend, and a woman trying to live a normal life. She was juggling a lot, but she never lost sight of the goal: to create a world where stories like hers no longer happened, where people could walk through life without fearing that the color of their skin would make them a target. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, Marcus walked in holding a letter. His face was unreadable, and Deja immediately felt a shift in the air. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Marcus sat down across from her, slowly opening the envelope. "It's from the boutique," he said, his eyes scanning the letter. "They're offering an apology, but they're also offering a settlement. They want to compensate you for the emotional distress." Deja's heart raced. She had never expected this, had never wanted money or material compensation for what had happened. What she wanted was change, accountability, and recognition that this kind of behavior had to stop. "What does that even mean?" she asked, her voice quiet. Marcus leaned forward, looking at her with a mixture of understanding and caution. "They're trying to settle this behind the scenes. They probably want it to go away quietly," he said, his tone cautious. "But you don't have to accept it, Deja. If you don't feel that this is right, we can keep pushing forward. We can continue to fight for accountability." Deja thought about it for a long moment. Her mind flashed back to that day in the boutique, the accusation, the shame, the humiliation. But more than that, she remembered how far they had come since then, the voices that had joined hers in solidarity, the power of speaking out. She couldn't go back to the place where everything was about money. She was fighting for something bigger than that. "No," Deja said firmly, shaking her head. I'm not interested in a settlement. This isn't about money. It's about changing how people think, how people act. It's about making sure this never happens again, not just to me, but to anyone else." Marcus nodded, proud of her decision. He knew this wasn't easy for her, but he also knew it was the right choice. "I agree," he said. "Let's keep moving forward. We can make a real difference." Over the next few days, Deja and Marcus worked together to draft a response. Deja wrote a letter to the boutique, declining the settlement and instead offering them an opportunity to meet with local advocacy groups to sit down and truly understand the impact of their actions. She wanted them to invest in real change, not just lip service. When the boutique received the letter, they were taken aback. The manager called Marcus personally, and they discussed the next steps. It was clear that the boutique was not used to dealing with people who wouldn't be silenced or bought off, and Deja knew that this was the first real step toward the accountability she had been fighting for. But as the days turned into weeks, Deja realized that her fight wasn't just about the boutique anymore. It had become a fight for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, every person who had been discriminated against, judged, or accused simply because of who they were. She was becoming more than just a voice. She was a symbol of the change that was so desperately needed. The movement was growing, and Deja knew that no matter what came next, she couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake, and together with Marcus by her side, she was ready to see it through to the end. The response from the boutique had been unexpected, but it was a step in the right direction. Deja and Marcus had declined the settlement offer, opting instead to push for a more meaningful conversation about accountability and change. It wasn't just about correcting one mistake. It was about creating a ripple effect, pushing businesses, organizations, and individuals to think differently about the way they interacted with people of color. Deja couldn't settle for anything less than real, lasting change. In the days that followed, Deja's advocacy continued to gain momentum. Her social media presence exploded, with hundreds of messages and comments pouring in from people around the world, sharing their own stories of discrimination and racial profiling. Some were stories of blatant mistreatment, others of subtle, everyday biases that often went unnoticed or unchallenged, but all of them were important. Deja had never imagined that her experience in a boutique could spark such a powerful wave of conversation, but as the messages kept coming, she realized the depth of the issue. It wasn't just about the one incident. It was about a system of injustice that affected millions. People were finally starting to open up, to speak their truth, and to demand better. But as her voice grew louder, so did the opposition. The more Deja spoke out, the more resistance she encountered. There were those who tried to discredit her, to silence her by questioning her intentions or attacking her character. Some people dismissed her story, claiming that it was an isolated incident or that she was simply overreacting. Others tried to label her as a troublemaker or an attention seeker. It was exhausting. At times, Deja felt overwhelmed, as if she were carrying the weight of an entire movement on her shoulders. She could see how easily others could be worn down by the negativity, by the constant barrage of criticism. But she wasn't going to back down. She had come too far, and there were too many people relying on her to stay strong. Marcus, ever the steady force by her side, saw the toll it was taking on her. He could tell when she was exhausted, when the weight of it all was becoming too much. He had always admired her strength, but he also knew that even the strongest people needed support. He made it a point to be her anchor, reminding her of why they started this journey in the first place. "Deja," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after a long day of meetings and phone calls, "I know it's tough, but you're doing something incredible. You've sparked a conversation that needed to happen. People are listening, and that's what matters." Deja looked at him, his unwavering support a balm for her tired soul. "I know, Marcus. I don't know if I'm making enough of a difference. It feels like we're barely scratching the surface." "You're making more of a difference than you realize," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't going to change overnight, but you've already given people a platform to speak up. You've already made them feel like they're not alone. That's huge." Deja nodded, taking a deep breath. Marcus was right. It wasn't going to happen in one moment. in one post, or in one meeting. Change was a long, difficult journey, and sometimes it felt like they were fighting an uphill battle. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for. Every person who reached out to her, every story shared, was proof that the fight for justice was not just her own. It was a collective effort, one that spanned across communities and generations. The next few weeks were crucial. Deja continued to work with advocacy groups, organizing community events, and pushing the boutique to follow through on their promise of accountability. She had also begun speaking at schools and local organizations, sharing her experience and encouraging others to stand up for what was right. The movement was growing, and Deja felt more determined than ever to see it through. But there were moments when the pressure seemed unbearable. The public eye was a double-edged sword. While it brought attention to the cause, it also brought scrutiny. Deja found herself questioning her own strength, wondering if she could truly carry this fight for as long as it needed to go on. Marcus could see the fatigue in her eyes, and one evening, he did something that brought her a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. He planned a quiet night at home, just the two of them, no phones, no meetings, no distractions. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Deja of what they were fighting for, their love, their shared values, and the world they wanted to build together. As they sat in the soft glow of the living room, laughing over a movie and sharing stories of their day, Deja realized that sometimes the most important moments weren't the ones filled with rallies or speeches. They were the moments of rest, of grounding, and of remembering why they had started this journey in the first place. "I'm in this for the long haul," she whispered to Marcus as they snuggled together on the couch. "We'll make it through. Together." And with that, Deja knew, no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, they would continue fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been silenced for too long. Together, they would make sure their voices were heard. Months had passed since Deja and Marcus had taken a stand against the boutique, and their lives had been irrevocably changed. The ripple effect of Deja's story continued to spread, touching the lives of countless people. What had started as a deeply personal fight for justice had grown into a national conversation about race, bias, and accountability. They had not only sparked a movement, they had become part of a larger wave of activism that was gaining momentum across the country. But the journey had not been without its challenges. Despite the overwhelming support, Deja and Marcus had faced their fair share of criticism, as well as a growing sense of pressure. Deja, especially, felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. The calls to action, the media interviews, and the demands for her to continue speaking out sometimes felt endless. The constant scrutiny had begun to take its toll, and though she had always been resilient, she found herself longing for moments of quiet, of peace. She would often sit in the evenings, looking out the window of their home, reflecting on how far they had come. At times, she wondered if the emotional labor of this fight was ever going to end, or if this was just the beginning of a much larger movement. One evening, as they were winding down after a particularly exhausting week, Marcus looked at her with a softness in his eyes. "Deja," he said, his voice warm but laced with concern, "how are you really doing?" She smiled faintly, knowing exactly what he meant. "I'm okay," she replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of fatigue. "But I've been thinking, maybe it's time we take a step back for a little while. We've done so much and I don't want to lose myself in this fight. I don't want to forget what's important." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had seen how deeply she cared about the cause, how fiercely she fought for change. But he also knew that they couldn't pour from an empty cup. They needed to protect their well-being, and sometimes that meant stepping away, even if only for a short time. "I think you're right," he said, gently taking her hand. "We've been so focused on everything outside of us, but it's important to focus on what's within our home, our relationship. We can't keep fighting if we're not also taking care of ourselves." Deja leaned against him, feeling the comforting strength of his support. "I've been thinking about that too. I'm proud of everything we've accomplished, but I need a break. A real one." They made the decision to take some time off, to step away from the constant public eye and reconnect with one another. To go back to the simple things, the quiet mornings together, the laughter, the peace they had before all of this began. As they planned a small getaway to a cabin in the mountains, Deja felt a sense of relief wash over her. She realized that in the chaos of their activism, they had sometimes forgotten to nurture the most important part of the journey, their love and their bond. During their time away, Deja and Marcus found the space to breathe, to reflect, and to recharge. They spent their days hiking, cooking together, and talking about their dreams for the future. It wasn't that they were stepping away from their mission. It was that they needed to be whole in order to continue it. They knew that to create lasting change, they had to be grounded in love and mutual support. After a week of rest, they returned home, feeling more centered and rejuvenated. Deja knew that she wasn't done fighting, that there was still so much work to be done. But now she had a clearer sense of balance. She would continue speaking out, continue demanding justice, but she would also continue nurturing the things that made her strong: her family, her community, and her inner peace. Back in the world of activism, Deja's voice was as powerful as ever, but now she spoke with even greater clarity. She had learned that real change came not just from the protests and the speeches, but from the daily acts of kindness, the small moments of connection, and the relationships that grounded her. Deja's mission had always been about more than just herself. It was about the future, about making sure that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles. And with Marcus by her side, she knew that no matter how long it took, they would see this fight through. Together, they would keep pushing for change, one step at a time. And through it all, Deja never forgot the lesson she had learned, that in the pursuit of justice, taking care of yourself was just as important as taking care of others.